Do not adjust your screens. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network on a special Monday edition here, 7:01 in the p.m. So glad to bring it to you tonight. I am going to be gone next week, and I don't want to shortchange you on shows for all the FFPC players watching, which is why we're doing this bonus show tonight. I am Eric Balkman from the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, the RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown, and of course, the Fantasy Football Players Championship. Follow me on the X at Eric Balkman. Joined tonight by the original fantasy football contrarian himself on X at FF_contrarian. You follow all his work he does on rotoviz.com. He is Shawn Siegele. Shawn, welcome into the show tonight. Thanks so much for hanging out with me.
Yeah, I'm excited. Did this a while back, and blasting through these 2 hours, it's both exciting and a workout.
Yes, yeah, that's totally true. And it goes back and forth. Sometimes workout comes first and then excitement. But we're going to go through all that tonight. It's going to be a fun 2 hours coming up on the show. Shawn and I are going to go through the NFL, everything that's going on right now. Yeah, I know there's not a lot, but there is some stuff that can affect your drafts as far as how you want to build your teams right now. We're going to find out where Shawn stands on certain players as far as the FFPC Best Ball Tournament goes. And then we'll get into, in the second hour, we'll talk a little bit about the FFPC SuperFlex Tournament and some tips that you need to focus on drafting there, as well as some players that you maybe want to focus on as well. And then we'll wrap it up with a Dynasty segment. How do you get that elusive perpetual championship window? We're going to have some tips. Well, I won't, but I'm going to ask Shawn because he's got a lot of tips, because he's got a lot of success at it. A guy who's played a lot of FFPC over the years. And of course, the primetime champion. Shawn, what was that in the NFFC when you hit the primetime winner? Was that 2013?
2013. Finished 1-2.
Nice work. Absolutely. What a year for you that was, right? I mean, what was that like watching that down the stretch to find out not only that you finished first, but second as well?
It was pretty exciting. The second was like a point. So always fun to have those things come through. I'm from Kansas City. Jamal Charles did most of the work.
Was the Charles
we did none
here,
of it.
Yeah.
It was very exciting.
More excitement to come on the show tonight, ladies and gentlemen. As a reminder, the 2024 Fantasy Pros Championship is live. If you're looking to win $1 million in the FFPC this year at just a $350 entry fee, this is the way to do it. myffpc.com is where to go. We just had a draft pop off within the last couple of minutes, and we'll have drafts filling up the rest of the night. They're pretty much filling up every day now as we're hitting. This is late June already. I know it sounds crazy, but we're in the midst of drafting season. We're in the thick of it. So make sure you're registering now and taking your shot at that $1 million grand prize. You can either go to myffpc.com, or thanks to our wonderful producer, Matt Deutsch, you can just scan that QR code on your screen right now, and that'll take you right to it as well. A $1 million grand prize and a $6 million prize pool, as well as we're going to have the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, SuperFlex Tournament tonight as well. You can go to register for those as well. $300,000 grand prize in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, $100,000 grand prize in the FFPC SuperFlex Best Ball Tournament. And check out the Empire and Dynasty startups we have going on right now at myffpc.com. As I said, shout out to our producer, Matt Deutsch tonight. Let's get into it, Shawn. John Shipley, who covers the NFL for Sports Illustrated, reports that Tank Bigsby, quote, did not have the standout offseason program that he had last year. Now, I got to be honest with you. I listened to a lot of shows. I read a lot of stuff, and everybody said Tank Bigsby, to the point where I was wondering if, my God, is Travis Etienne going to be a bust that Bigsby's going to eat into his workload? And now I read this, and he did not have a good season last year, obviously. But now I read this, and that he didn't have the standout offseason program that he had in 2023. I'm souring almost to the point where I'm like, do I need to look at Dearness Johnson? Do I need to look at Keelan Robinson on this team? This is not what you want to hear if you're a Bigsby owner. But I guess the thing is, and we can apply this to the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, if you're drafting the guy behind the guy, is it still Bigsby in Jacksonville for you?
I don't know that you need to go that route at this point. We know Travis Etienne had, in his own way, a disappointing season also last year, but so much of that seemed to be the complete lack of creativity the Jacksonville Jaguars went out there with. Etienne is a guy who has elite speed to the outside. He's the home run threat. You want to get him in space. They talked during the offseason about him hitting the hole better. And yet when you look at some of the charting numbers, he was already elite at that. It was the wrong thing to be emphasizing. If you can get a Travis Etienne to bounce some of these runs and make the big play, that's where your big fantasy scores. There were so many 1, 2, and 3 yard runs from a guy who's absolutely electric. I guess I don't care so much about Tank Bigsby other than I did think that he was a solid late round pick. Last year, all of the promotion around him didn't fit his profile. He was not as good as a college player as I wouldn't say people seem to think, but just what the rhetoric and the enthusiasm got to at a certain point. And so some of this contrast, I think, is just a matter of expectation. And once you've seen the guy perform poorly at the NFL level, it's easier to come back and say, well, now we're seeing his flaws as opposed to seeing his strengths in these summer workouts. I did think he was a guy you could get as a post-hype candidate. I now more think you really just want ETN in Jacksonville and the late round guys. You look at that FFPC best ball tournament, players like an Estime, a Garendo, even if he is third string, someone like a Will Shipley, a Dylan Laube. I mean, those names become more exciting if you don't have to occasionally click on Bigsby.
So I want to get back to some of those names that you mentioned in a second, especially Shipley and Garendo. But regarding Travis Etienne, because Bigsby has clouded up the backup spot here in Jacksonville, where we don't, if we look at the FFPC best ball tournament right now, according to Fantasy Mojo right now, Bigsby's an 18th round pick. Keelan Robinson is a 20th round pick. Travis Etienne's a mid third round pick. Should he be going higher given the fact that there is not a lot of definition behind him? In other words, somebody to regularly take snaps away from him? Or Shawn, is he the type of player that we do want to see him only get 60 to 70% of the touches there because that makes him more effective?
I don't think it necessarily makes him more effective. I just think they have to run a better offense. I think the receivers that they have added give them some more flexibility. I do think that Doug Peterson will come out and run a better offense because he's had some success in the past. I think that he got too passive, rested on the laurels a little bit. They were not one of those offenses that really maximized the talent that they had. You even hear some of those things from Calvin Ridley as he departs. I think that they'll be better. When you look at the prices right now, I think that he is in the right spot and that you have this little gap after Achane and Williams. I think there is a tiny tier break there. I think he should be going well ahead of Pacheco. That's where he is. The difficult part is he's in this range where you get Waddle, Ayuk, Malik Neighbors, Deebo Samuel, coming off of a season where the play calling and the scheme was so poor. Do you want to invest in those touches if you think they're going to be lower value than we might have thought going into the 2023 season, where really you wanted to and thought you could get some explosiveness from Travis Etienne? And this is the guy, again, Etienne is probably undervalued from a pure talent perspective with the number of touches he's going to get. He should be more expensive, but it's hard to do after you watched last season. This was one of the greatest college football players of all time and an unreal athlete, but last year was just so disappointing.
Yeah. And I think Etienne is a guy that as we get closer and closer to the live events in Las Vegas with the FFPC, I think he's an ADP that I'll definitely be watching, maybe more so than some of the other running backs in that range, but it is compelling. Speaking of compelling, Garendo, Shipley, let's dip into the late round picks of the FFPC best ball tournament. Why, guys that are not expected to be the backups on their team, and maybe Shipley is, I don't know, we'll see what happens there. But Garendo for sure is not, at least to start off the season. Why do these guys still matter when you're trying to win a $300,000 grand prize, Shawn?
Well, with the 49ers, they've had a real problem keeping their backups healthy, and especially the guy who's supposedly a second string is never healthy. Now, I don't know how much we want to lean into that, but even when he's not playing, he's not healthy, right? You've got to check every week. When the previous week McCaffrey has had 25 touches, Mitchell barely played. You're like, well, did he get hurt in practice? That kind of thing is problematic when you're trying to go to the second guy. And I think this is the wrong time of the season to be confident about who the second stringer is, even listening to the team, because they haven't gotten a chance to really see this guy out there. They rave about Garendo. And when you're talking size, speed, profile, very few people touch him. Now, the reason he's going so late is most people also know that he wasn't a particularly good college football player. And yet I think that gets a little bit overstated, in addition to the fact that maybe the area where he stands out a little bit more is in the receiving game. We know that those receiving touches are so important. And so if he were to get a little bit of that and then score a few of these touchdowns, if you have one offensive system where you don't need to be maybe as good as you would otherwise be to score a long touchdown where the speed is going to matter, you're probably thinking Miami, where you have Jaylen Wright, and then you have the 49ers. So if he gets thrust into some space, you get a couple of those long runs. You think about Chase Brown last year with the big play, especially in best ball when you don't have to figure out how to start it. That is a pretty unique and powerful weapon in the very final rounds.
He is the one half of the voice of the Stealing Bananas podcast, along with Ben Gretsch. Shawn Siegele joining me here on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show tonight. I want to shift to, often, the quickest way to get people to tune out from the show right away. Hey, let's lead off with a backup running back in Jacksonville and then a potential number 2 receiver in New England. So this is what we're doing tonight. We're really testing the viewership, Shawn, to see how passionate they are. Let's talk about DeMario Douglas, because according to The Athletic, Chad Graff, who covers the Patriots for that publication, DeMario Douglas was apparently the best and most explosive playmaker in the OTAs, the mini camps that the Patriots had this spring. Last year, he was a 6th-round pick. He was their leading receiver last year with the better part of 600 yards. He played just about 68% of his snaps from the slot last year. And once again, comes back to a team that he could be the leading receiver on. What did New England do in the offseason? Well, they did draft Javon Baker. They did draft Jaylen Polk in the 2nd, Javon Baker in the 4th. But this is a player that has the opportunity to get a lot of targets this year. He had 4 double-digit PPR performances last season, and that was a bad offense. Now he gets Drake Maye, we think, who is going to be the starting quarterback there. You're always looking for these angles late, right, Shawn, in the FFPC best ball tournament. 16th-round pick for DeMario Douglas, who's going right after his real-life teammate, Jaylen Polk. But this is Marvin Mims, Michael Wilson, Demarcus Robinson territory. Your thoughts on how many shares you want to have of DeMario Douglas this year?
Well, this is a tricky one because I do think that wide receiver group could be split across 4 names. And if you also expect the passing game to be bad, then probably none of them are appealing. And yet reports like this back up what he did as a rookie. Mm-hmm. And you talk about being split across the 4 names. So 2 of those names are rookies who are probably overdrafted. You look at Jaylen Polk, a lot of signs point to him having been the 3rd best receiver on his college team. He's going to get opportunity with where they picked him. He makes some circus catches. He is not consistent. You look at Javon Baker as potentially being the better prospect there, and yet some of the red flags probably don't work out very well. You've got a vertical receiver who's not a great athlete, which always, I think, raises at least some eyebrows about how some of that will translate. And his other problem is drops, which also seemed to be an issue with him in just the handful of workouts they've already had. So if you drop passes, you're in a bad offense. I mean, how much are those guys going to be involved, especially at the beginning? And then if you have Jacoby Brissett play some games and play well, and he was absolutely fantastic last year, Douglas seems like someone who really should be going in that Jacoby Myers, Khalil Shakir, Joshua Palmer, Brandon Cooks, Romeo Doubs type of area. Josh Downs a little bit after that. Why are those guys clearly better names than someone going, almost free?
So in your opinion, Douglas is still a value in the FFPC best ball tournament?
I think if we can continue to get these reports, he would be the guy. One of the things that I think is interesting about Drake Maye is that you're really looking for him to take over maybe a month into the season and throw his body around, be sort of a poor man's Josh Allen, in which case I don't know that you have to play any of the receivers, even if you have Maye. So this could be a no receiver group in terms of how we want to look at it for fantasy. But Douglas is a guy who, if we get better QB play than expected, which is certainly possible, then he's somebody who, again, his ADP doesn't really make sense when you look at his profile versus other players who are going in round 12, almost merely because fantasy managers are like, well, we got to draft somebody there. We can look at target volume, but can you win with those players going in round 12? I mean, I always say that, and then there's a guy who does win from that group.
But you never know
how you play it.
That's the thing is maybe there's not a good way to play it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I would be passing on that round. And if you're going to target a guy on volume, especially if you don't like the passing games for some of those other teams, I mean, someone like a Brandon Cooks, obviously you love that passing game, but there are some teams in there like Jacoby Myers. Jacoby Myers, a very good reality player, probably not a good fit for fantasy in 2024.
I think, and we had a question about this in the YouTube chat. Dom Guzzetti, our good buddy, says, first off, drafting Brandon Ayuk is scary. When do you take him? And as a bench now. So there's a lot to unpack here. I'm going to bring this up right now. Ryan Clark was on NFL Live on ESPN earlier this afternoon. And apparently, according to Clark, the Niners and Ayuk were supposed to meet with each other at some time today. He said that Ayuk has taken these contract negotiations as personal. Last week, we saw the Instagram of Ayuk talking with Commanders quarterback Jayden Daniels saying the Niners don't want him anymore. And then the Niners came back and say, well, that's not exactly what we said, but they basically don't want him at the price Ayuk is asking for. Right now, he can earn about $14 million if he plays under the franchise tag for 2024. This is a player who caught 75 passes for 1,300 plus yards last year, got in the end zone 7 times. If he gets traded, I'm assuming that team that would trade for him would be more than willing to not only feature him in the offense, Shawn, but they'd give him that big lucrative deal. According to Ryan Clark, Ayuk wants to remain with the Niners, but bear in mind, the Niners just soaked a first-round draft pick into Ricky Pearsall, the wide receiver out of Florida, so they obviously value him. This could be a year where the Niners just put all these weapons on the field for Purdy, Pearsall, Ayuk, Samuel, Kittle, McCaffrey, all those guys, and just make another run for it and try to topple the Chiefs or whoever represents the AFC this year, and then figure out Ayuk next year. However, if they do trade him, which I still think there's a non-zero chance of doing it, all of a sudden Pearsall becomes very valuable. Now, I want to frame this question. It's a twofold one. Number one, how do you handle Pearsall in the FFPC best ball tournament, knowing that at any moment his value could spike big time if there is an Ayuk trade? And then number two, as Dom Gazzetti is pointing out, how do we handle Brandon Ayuk, given everything that's going on with him right now with the potential trade and potential new team? How do we handle that when we're drafting, trying to win $300K?
So Pearsall is interesting to me because he, in theory, is blocked, and I think he was overdrafted. So he's similar to the Polk situation there. I love the Jacob Cowing pick, who's someone who in his past has both vertical ability and he has the underneath ability. He's excellent with the ball in his hands. Not a headline type of play, and yet somebody who gives the 49ers even more optionality. So what they've done is created an incredible amount of leverage for themselves in working through this. The leverage that they have probably does increase the risk that you're going to miss some time for Ayuk. And you probably want to be aware of that. One of the things that I've kind of worked through recently is that, Debo still outscored him last year, despite some of the crazy splits in usage. You look at the target depth and how that kind of washes back into yards per target and some of the yards per route elements for Ayuk. And yet Samuel's ability with the ball in his hands, both when he's a receiver and just as a runner, create this incredible scoring profile. So I think they should be on Samuel ahead of Ayuk, even if these other elements weren't there. And so I lean that way a little bit. It's funny because Zachary Kruger and I are currently drafting a SuperFlex team, and I made him kind of wait until we got beyond ADP. We're there like a round and a half beyond where he goes, like 18th round, SuperFlex. We went ahead and pulled the trigger on Pearsall. Once you're in that range, obviously, you would expect anything that happens to really, really work for you. I think it's hard here. One of the historical elements with this 49ers passing attack is that despite the lack of passing volume, they support a lot of receivers at a high level. And so even if so much of it is on efficiency, we know they have the players, we know they have the coaching staff, we now know, more clearly that they have a QB who can get it done. I guess I'm more skeptical that someone filling in would be able to do it because Brandon Ayuk is fantastic, right? That's the reason that he feels like he has the leverage. They don't want to let that go as they try and make another run. They've been so close to the Chiefs a couple times. I guess I think that he plays for the 49ers and plays well, and Pearsall doesn't really do much this season. But as you're building your teams out, you certainly want to be aware of the other scenarios.
How do you handle Ayuk? So this isn't just an Ayuk question. This is sort of like a wide scoping question because we often hear players like this, Shawn, at this time of year. They want a new deal. They don't want to play on the team. Do you often find that players like that have been good buys in the long run when you look back on it, or has it just had a negligible, insignificant effect?
I think when you get them knocked down a tier, then there's some real potential. You obviously have that risk because I didn't think there was any chance that we would get from Le'Veon Bell what ended up happening.
Right.
And so you want to be aware of that, especially when the price is very high. I don't see right now across the various leagues a situation where you're getting any type of real value on Ayuk. I mentioned that the 49ers have been able to support these guys along with a George Kittle. To me, even with the information coming out that Kittle has lost all of this weight, he's in something of a race to get ready and just be able to build his body back up to be, what you want to see from him during the season. But I mean, Kittle wasn't healthy last year, still puts up a big campaign. If you are looking for values or you're looking for ways to play the 49ers, especially in tight end premium, he seems like a lot easier way to do it. Having said that, there are a huge chunk of drafts that I come out with either Samuel or Ayuk.
You have you wrote that the big target piece on rotoviz.com, and you had there was 27 priorities for you on this list. We'll get into some of those later on in the program. Where did Ayuk fall on this, and have you changed your thoughts on him? Right now, Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver 15 at the 306. Does that represent a priority for you? Is he a target? Is he an emergency type? How do you handle him, where he's going at the moment if you're drafting in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament tonight?
Yeah, tonight I don't think that you need to rush out and get that price. We just talked about ETN. You can pull the trigger there. I think you can go with Kyle Pitts. Getting the value, if you want to call it that, on Malik Neighbors in this format, I think is a fun way to play it. Or just take Deebo Samuel. Again, he's the guy I have ranked higher. And so even though I tend to play it where if I'm at a spot where both are available, then you would take the guy with the higher ADP just because you don't always have that chance. You'll end up with skewed exposures if you don't work through that. We are in a little bit of a window where even if you want to push that on Ayuk, I think you can do it.
I want to move forward from the best team in the NFC, which we were just talking about in the Niners. Let's go to the worst team in the NFC last year, and that's the Carolina Panthers. Now, Adam Thielen, according to Pro Football Talk, was quoted as saying a few days ago, I think on Friday, quote from him, Thielen, about Bryce Young. It's been awesome. Not only him, just a lot of the young guys, a lot of the staff. It's been just a great offseason to see some of these guys who haven't been in the league very long, just the way that they've come in with confidence. You can tell Bryce's demeanor in the building. He's just more comfortable, right? And you don't realize it when you start getting to be a veteran guy because you forget about those times. A lot of the people who've been covering the Panthers, Shawn, have been very emphatic about how much better Bryce Young looks this year. We look at what Dan Morgan, the first-year GM of the Panthers, did in bringing in Deontay Johnson and Jatavian Sanders and Jonathan Brooks and Xavier Legette, all these different playmakers, something that they didn't really do for him last year. He had the second worst adjusted EPA per dropback in 2023. And obviously you'd like to think that along with the return of Adam Thielen, Bryce Young can't help but be better this year. My question to you is, when you look at that Carolina Panthers offense and you think about drafting him in a SuperFlex league or maybe even the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, quarterback 25 right now, is this the time? Is the iron hot on Bryce Young right now where it's only going to go up? Is now the time to be getting him, or are you still a little bit cautious when it comes to be drafting him? And that, quite frankly, the rest of the Carolina pass catchers as well.
Yeah, I don't think that you have to rush out and draft Young. I think what it allows you to do is to be more comfortable when you're clicking on Deontay, on Xavier Legette, on Jatavian Sanders late. I think that as we look through it, one of the things, Dave Caban has great QB research that he has on the site each season and in the RotoViz rookie guide. He was very insistent that CJ Stroud was going to be the guy. And so after you have some of these things happen in retrospect, and certainly the Carolina Panthers regret what they did, it's easy to think that these guys were separated by a massive amount in terms of what they were as prospects, when the reality is probably that Stroud was a slightly better prospect. And then you have one guy hit, a 98th percentile outcome and one a 2%, and now they look completely different. But Young, had enough encouraging elements to his collegiate career that when you come back out and say, okay, he looks a lot better, there's some reason to think it's not completely made up, teammate speak, coach speak, all of those types of things. But we do want to understand that this is a guy who was playing at a Will Levis level, at a Zach Wilson level last season. So when you get better from that, you could still be bad. Having said that, you get the better coaching staff, you get an opportunity with just such dramatically upgraded targets. Some of the research I've done, which again, this is very intuitive, But the young QBs, when they get the weapons upgrades, they tend to break out if they do break out. And you can contrast what they did to him last year with what the Bears have done for Caleb Williams. I mean, Williams, now knowing what we know, is probably just a better prospect regardless. But him being put into this better situation in 2024 should help him, but then that should filter down to his weapons, which are really pretty reasonably priced.
Do you have any favorites on Carolina? I mean, take Bryce Young out of the equation, but when you've been drafting best ball teams this year, Shawn, do you have any favorite Panthers players?
Well, for a while I had the rookie receiver there with them having, made a statement with that pick, ranked, about a round ahead of ADP. And I've kind of worked through that, and I don't want to get a large exposure to him, more just around the market. But I think that the potential for an explosion is there, even with how raw he is. The athleticism is off the charts. Deontay Johnson, his price based on what he has done. And one of the things last year, even with how horrible the Pittsburgh passing game was, you got some better depth on his targets, and within context especially, he did a nice job. He's somebody who can probably reemerge out of this multi-year situation where the quarterback play for the Steelers was apocalyptic, right? And so he's a guy I think you should target. And then specifically because of price, Jatavian Sanders, one of these guys who's getting massively knocked because his pro day. I mean, I don't know why you go do that pro day. It was, he tested like a very clearly undrafted player and maybe not even a priority UDFA when he didn't have to do that. He was that good as a college player.
And the other thing, just to talk about the pro day, because I was underwhelmed too. And I was like, well, he had to be sick or he had to be dealing with some sort of soft tissue injury. I didn't see any reports about that. If I'm his agent, I'm putting that out, right? Like, just regardless, like of whether he was actually dealing with it or not. I didn't see that, which I think it caused him to drop in FFPC rookie drafts. I mean, you were in a ton of FFPC rookie drafts this year. You probably saw the same thing, right?
Well, I mean, every draft, I felt like he was the best value once you got kind of into the middle of round 2. And still, I do a lot of these with co-managers because it's so much fun to execute it that way. I could not talk people into him because people know, like, the athleticism is a huge factor in how these tight ends specifically translate to the NFL. You go out and test like that, people do not want you. And, but that's despite the fact that when you contrast him to those Texas receivers, a lot of the numbers are very, very encouraging. And those receivers have off the charts athleticism. So within that context of that same offense, he was very, very good. The thing that I saw, which I think is sort of humorous as it gets to your note, what I read as quotes from him, and again, I wouldn't put any emphasis on this, but he was claiming that he just was so amped up that it kind of sapped, which will happen to people. But I don't know if you can put out publicly that you underperformed athletically because you were excited. Like, that's a hard one to sell too.
Yeah. Like, the reason I sucked is because I was just so excited to be out there. I don't know if that's going to fly in the NFL. But it's as the kids say, it's one way to do it. We just talked about the Patriots with DeMario Douglas a little bit ago. Let's go back to New England here because there's a big contract extension with Ramondre Stevenson earlier last week. Now, or late last week, I should say. 4 years, $36 million. He is going to be 26 years old, and now he's under contract through the 2028 season, excuse me. He is going to be, he's rushed for just over 2,200 yards and 14 touchdowns in the last 3 seasons with the Patriots. He's caught 121 balls for a shade under 800 yards as well. Now, last season, 4.4 yards per touch. That was the worst it's been in his tenure in the NFL. But Mac Jones is no longer the quarterback there, right? You're going to have Drake Maye, or as you alluded before, Jacoby Brissett potentially as well. Alex Van Pelt's the new OC there. $17 million guaranteed, $8 million signing bonus, $12 million in incentives. Shawn, you in your career have explored all the different numerical and statistical inferences that reflect the way that you, I don't want to say build your rankings, but they are an element in your rankings. How much attention do you pay to or how much attention do you pay to a contract like this given that New England seemingly wants him to be the man this year, but they also brought in Antonio Gibson as well, which could hurt Stevenson's pass catching on third downs, which as high-stakes fantasy football players, we love to have on our teams. Ramondre Stevenson, running back 19, the end of the 6th round in the FFPC best ball tournament. It's after Aaron Jones, but it's before DeAndre Swift. Has this contract changed the way you think about Stevenson in best ball tournaments for 2024?
And Colin and I kind of went into some more detail on this for, I believe, the Wednesday show on Overtime. It is interesting. I think that he's fairly priced. He was a guy I liked last year because not only were the raw numbers, but the peripherals for him were so impressive from those first several seasons that you mentioned. And when you get a guy of that size who's such a good receiving back, I mean, you're getting to the edge of like the Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson kind of peak season potential. Obviously, that would be the high outcome. Instead, we get a catastrophic outcome. The thing that I would note is there still was a big split between where he was and where Ezekiel Elliott was. And so once you adjust for how bad the context was there, I don't think that he was as awful last season as it appears on the surface. Now, he wasn't good, right? He was far worse than those other campaigns. And yet I think when you adjust for context, you don't necessarily immediately put him into that kind of dead zone back type of player to where it's only going to be whatever the offense gives you. I mean, Joe Mixon is a pretty good example of a guy like that. Josh Jacobs, even kind of a guy who's like that, where they're going to give you what the offense provides. And for Joe Mixon, because he's played for the Cincinnati Bengals and now with the Houston Texans, you're like, well, the offense provides a lot. And so you are going to work there. I think the flip side with Stevenson is if he has a dead zone profile and he plays for the New England Patriots, then you really wouldn't want him at almost any price. I think that he's closer to still being that star caliber guy. For me, he's priced exactly right in that he should be going after Kenneth Walker and Aaron Jones. He should be going right before DeAndre Swift and David Montgomery.
So from a share standpoint, you're not going out of your way to target this guy. You're not going out of your way to fade this guy. But if he does represent a value, then you're hopping on him, right?
Yeah, so if you get your team set to where a running back makes sense, he's also one of these guys where, I mean, it may seem weird and just like very obvious to say, but there is this cohort of players where you are really keeping track of when they drop. Because when they drop, say 2/3 of a round, they become a really good pick. I mean, he's currently going right before Jayden Reed and Xavier Worthy. I would have a really hard time pulling the trigger there. He falls in the middle of round 7. Maybe Ladd McConkey is gone, and your next receiver picks are Christian Watson, Deontay Johnson, DeAndre Hopkins. There are certainly ways that those guys can work. But at that point, I think you're thinking Ramondre could be the guy. And the other thing about it with the contract, it I think does give us a little bit more of a window into what they're thinking with Antonio Gibson. Gibson is one of these guys who's always sort of discussed as a receiving back because of the receiving background that he has going back to college. And yet when he was dynamic for Washington, it was really based on what was probably fluky and kind of a sequencing type of element, but he scored a lot of short touchdowns going in his rookie season. It wasn't really the receiving element, which he consistently lost with the Commanders to other types of players. I guess now that we have the contract, it's even easier to tell yourself the story where Stevenson actually is more or less the guy and Gibson is almost exclusively a contingent play that requires Stevenson to get hurt.
It's interesting with Gibson too, because I think he still has value in a best ball tournament, because I think he could pay off there for sure. But in regards to with Stevenson, I want to. Well, there's two questions I want to ask, and they're both unfair. But that's what I do on the show. I ask my guests unfair questions. You mentioned 2/3 of a round for a player who drops like Stevenson could, right? Is that an all-encompassing number, 8 picks or what have you, that you look for when players drop? Is that a statistically significant number of picks that they fall in drafts where you start looking at like, oh, okay, now I have to start, thinking about adding more shares of this guy? Or is it such an individualized thing, Shawn, that it's difficult to put a numerical value on it?
Yeah, it's going to be tough, but I think that if he is the top player available at ADP, but it's basically just ADP, I'm going to be looking at who's the guy I have ranked the highest, who's the player who makes the most sense structurally. You still want that guy.
Right.
one of the things that was fun about doing the priority targets exercise is that there are really quite a few categories. You have the priority targets, the players where it's sort of win falls. And so these are the guys kind of in that Stevenson group where when they fall that sort of 2/3 of a round range, I want to scoop them up because I do want exposure. They're the players that I'm more or less fading completely. And then the guys who are very scenario based, where something else in the draft kind of determines whether or not you would pick them. But when you get those categories, you can start to think through how you want to approach the individual players in drafts and how you can get ADP value on the people that you like, but you think there are concerns or there are structural concerns. So one of the things you mentioned about the 2/3 of a round, it really depends on where the tier breaks are. And you're usually looking for that guy to drop below a tier break, and then you would get them.
And that makes perfect sense. And I think that you have to contextualize everything, especially with how your team looks. This is not the first or the second round. We're talking about Ramondre Stevenson here going in, whatever we said before. He is going in. It's at 6-7 turn, right? So your team could look radically different. And it's all about building your teams. Who was I just listening to the other day talking about, this goes back to and Shawn, I don't know if you ever played fantasy basketball, but there are certain leagues out there that are like 30-team leagues, right? And it's rotisserie style where, you got to fill up the categories or whatever, but your first round pick could really be, it changes the way the rest of your draft goes, right? Because of how statistically significant that pitch. Oh, I know who it was. Peter Overs that was talking about this. And he said, when you're playing best ball, you need to have quantity, you need to have quality, but you cannot have both at the same position, right? And so Stevenson could be quantity, he could be quality this year, but it all depends on how your first 5 picks went. In how you're building your team to try to win that 300K for sure. I want to step out and take a quick break. When we come back, let's continue our conversation with Shawn Siegele from Stealing Bananas podcast, RotoViz, everything that he's doing. Let's talk about where he stands on certain players like Bucky Irving, players like Blake Corum. Let's get into Jaylen Warren, Dalton Kincaid, and we'll lead things off with where Shawn Siegele stands on Chris Olave in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this.
Is Dynasty. And the place to play is myffpc.com. Go to myffpc, use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more. Now is the time to get in there and get set up with a startup draft. Now is the time, now that the rookies and everyone are set, because you can go in and you can start the draft and, you draft your Justin Jeffersons and Jamar Chases. And now that we know where the rookies are and where they're landing, you get going on that. So you want to try and set a startup draft for this week coming up if you're not involved yet. So go get involved. Use the QR code here or use the promo code that's in the link in the description here and get yourself going on Dynasty so you can really enjoy these players and draft the players you believe in. If you like Michael Penix Jr., you got to play Dynasty because you got to wait for him, but the payoff is big. And same with like Pearsall and Jackson Smith and Jigba and all these guys. Get in and do that. And I'll tell you what, the orphan leagues over there that we've been talking about, those all got bought up. They're actually all sold. People from this show I know took over a bunch of them. So right now, startups is the way to go. That's the way to rock and roll. It is startup season. Startup season and rookie draft season. That's what's up. Get set up at myffpc.com. Use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more and give you a leg up. No dealing with chasing around your friends and making them pay dues and having your buddy be like, oh, dude, I got to quit the league because I got a dog and I can't pay attention no more and I don't want to do trades. Forget all that. You can play online, MyFFPC, high stakes, low stakes, whatever you want to do with experts. And if somebody leaves the league, it goes in that orphan pool and somebody picks it up. The league has never been disbanded on FFPC.com. That's directly from Eric Balkman over there has told me that. So that's what's up. Get set up.
You are watching live the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. You just saw that video for the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, and that's what we've been talking a lot about tonight here with Shawn Siegele from the Stealing Bananas podcast. Of course, you check out all his work at rotoviz.com. Follow him on the X at FF_Contrarian. Shawn, I meant to bring this up at the top of the show. I forgot. I think is this the 10-year anniversary of the massive contrarian piece that you wrote that not only helped you win the NFFC primetime, but really, in my opinion, and this is not, I'm not just trying to, pump you up because you're the guest tonight. It really changed the way a lot of high stakes fantasy football players drafted teams. Are we coming up on 10-year, that landmark piece you did for RotoViz?
Yeah, I think it came out in the fall, sort of in season of 2013.
Okay.
And I was looking at some of the teams that were drafted, and the teams that finished 1-2 weren't the two highest teams, or weren't the highest regular scoring team from kind of that portfolio. It was a 0 RB team. I believe Calvin Johnson, Jimmy Graham, those are the days for those guys.
Right.
And it's interesting to look through. One of the things that is so fantastic about the FFPC contest is that you have the 2-2-2. So you have 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 2 flex. It allows for some other different types of things. And it doesn't force you into 0 RB in the same way that a lot of other contests may. But, it has been gratifying that, as we've kind of navigated through the decades since, more and more evidence does come out all the time, that, including a great article we just had from Jake Bose on RotoViz, looking at basically 0 RB, but very wide receiver heavy early, and what that does for you in best ball leagues.
I would encourage everybody to check out rotoviz.com to not only check out that piece, but everything Shawn and all the guys over there are working on is a fantastic website. It is one of the more data-driven websites you'll ever see, but everybody who is creating the data there, it does a great job of parsing it so you understand the data as well, which is everything we're looking for, right? And trying to win, $1 million in the Fantasy Pros Championship, the FFPC main event, $300K in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, so on and so forth. Mile High Luke is in the YouTube chat right now, and he wants to ask a Chicago Bears question here. If we look at the FFPC Best Ball Tournament ADP on Chicago running backs, Khalil Herbert and Roshan Johnson, they're not, I wouldn't say, me personally, Shawn, I'm not super high on either one of these guys. I'd like to have shares of both, but right now, the way they're being drafted in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament is Johnson at the 1507, Khalil Herbert at the 1607. I heard rumblings earlier in the offseason that Herbert might not make the team, which I think is still a possibility, but I haven't heard as much lately about that. Is it as simple as when you're drafting teams, you want to be even up on these guys? Or do you like one or the other? Or is it kind of a non-starter for you?
Well, Herbert, whether you look at things like yards per carry or evasion rate, yards over expected, what have you, not last year, but previous to that, had been one of the most explosive backs in the NFL. Last year was sort of a weird situation for the Chicago running backs, and Roshan didn't play particularly well last year either. We're in kind of a weird range of the offseason where I think it's tricky and dangerous to project guys off of their rosters and onto other rosters. But there is an NFL team out there that has Super Bowl aspirations and doesn't have a running back. And so you could certainly see a player, move in that direction in one way, shape, or form. Roshan, I think, is a little bit different in that he's a pretty narrow play. A lot has to happen anytime that you're in a situation where the starter probably has to get hurt or play really poorly. I've liked DeAndre Swift, but that contract did, I think, raise some eyebrows because last season was disappointing when you give him the Philadelphia context and what he was able to do with it, especially over the second half of the year. He struggled. So just actually playing his way out of the starting lineup isn't impossible, but it's pretty unlikely. So you need an injury and then you have a committee. Do you want that? But the flip side with Johnson is that he's kind of this high value touch player where he's a good receiver. You could use him around the goal line. In a committee, if he gets all the high value touches, maybe you score quite a bit. And so I do filter them in for some different reasons, especially at the price.
Let's get into the FFPC Best Ball Tournament edition of Where Do You Stand On? And Shawn, the guy I'll lead it off with, and I think we'll go in order of ADP as much as we can here because I think that's what makes it most compelling. I'm going to lead things off with Chris Olave, who is being drafted as the wide receiver 11. He's just behind Marvin Harrison Jr. and Drake London. He's just ahead of Devontae Adams and Nico Collins. Where do you stand in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament? Chris Olave at the 208. This would be a foundational piece. Is he a fade? Is he a target? How do you feel about him?
I like Olave, there are some very mild limitations to his game. He's not going to be as dynamic with the ball in his hands as, say, a CeeDee Lamb, but he's one of these guys who has an elite weighted targets per route run. And that's a stat you can find in our Stealing Signals tool, which obviously is branded after and gives you the stats that Ben Gretsch does in his fantastic Stealing Signals newsletter. One of the things that's kind of fun, we use Sports Info Solutions for our data provider. So it gives you a little bit of a different angle than maybe the data that people have from some other sources there. But when you have that elite weighted targets per route, you've got this potential to really break out. And again, I don't think that he can be CeeDee Lamb, but when you're looking at some of the things that he's already done, and one of the things with Lamb, one of the reasons why he was valued at the 1-2 turn last year and becomes this tournament crushing piece is because even though he was very good as a young player, we are now conditioned to want everybody to be Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase.
Yeah.
We think that Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors are going to somehow be like mid wide receiver ones as rookies, or at least that they have that in their range of outcomes, or else their prices don't make any sense. Olave, after disappointing a little bit, he is kind of the guy who I think as people get away from the season, they break down the numbers, they think through the situation there, that he's sort of this very mild riser, but he is kind of locked in to that general price due to how high it is and who the other players are. I don't think he can be CeeDee Lamb, but to see a big leap here, especially with the complete and total lack of target competition, right? If they're going to be successful, he has to have a massive year. The other element there is just that Derek Carr is not Dak Prescott. And yet Derek Carr, I think, is also better than people realize or want to give him credit for. You also have some structural things there with the dome, where if he plays okay, it'll play up a little bit. I like Chris Olave right there.
Yeah, I'm fine with him for sure. He's definitely not a fade, and sometimes I think like I'd have to look back where he was going last year, but I feel like he's slipped in ADP this year compared to where he was going last year, and I don't necessarily see a whole lot of like bad things that would cause me to let him slip that far. So a proven player coming off a less than average or a down year. Yeah, I like Olave too at that spot right there. Shawn, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of high stakes players over the last month plus about the Buffalo Bills offense and how it's going to be with Stephon Diggs in Houston, right? They bring in Curtis Samuel. They already had Khalil Shakir. Keon Coleman joins the party there as well. James Cook out of the backfield. Now Ray Davis is added to that offense as well. Tight end premium leagues, Dalton Kincaid, you could certainly make a case that he is going to be the guy that you want from Buffalo this year as far as a pass catcher goes. He is going off the board as the fourth tight end behind McBride, behind Kelsey, behind Laporta. But you are still paying the iron price for him, right? At the end of the second round, he goes slightly ahead of Mark Andrews. I guess the question here is, where do you stand on Dalton Kincaid being the guy in Buffalo who could have a massive season, who would return value at that end of the second round selection?
Yeah, so I think that you contextualize it really well right there, where tight end 4, I think people are going to be pretty comfortable with. You say you can get him after, Travis Kelce and Trey McBride. That's pretty exciting. And yet it's actually just that you still have to pick all of those guys in the second round. And so it doesn't do a lot for you, the fact that he is the tight end 4 as opposed to being the tight end 1. Having said that, he's one of the guys that I want to end up with very large exposure to, because you think about even that contrast with a Travis Kelce. Now, Travis Kelce is so established. He's such a superstar. If you fade him, you are risking embarrassment and getting crushed. And at the same time, the Chiefs now, if you assume a little bit of health and you assume that Rice's situation doesn't end up, costing him most of the year, the Chiefs are absolutely loaded. Whereas Buffalo essentially has nobody, right? They've got a bunch of like wide receiver 4 types of players. And Keon Coleman is interesting because he hasn't necessarily been a target hog or a consistent player, even at the college level. His numbers last year were not good. The guy that the Eagles get late in the draft, again, you've got different roles, you've got different, route numbers and that type of thing. But I mean, Johnny Wilson was better, right? And so that doesn't mean that Wilson's going to be better at the NFL level or even play very much. But there are a lot of questions about what Buffalo has done to address these holes. And at the same time, Kincaid averaged 13.8 in the FFPC scoring from week 7 on, and that included some low scores as well. If you come out and have a guy who just blows away the entire position in 2024, you could make a very good case that it's going to be him, because there isn't that competition for those targets, and you have Josh Allen, right? So with those two things together, the upside is absolutely insane. You contrast that with, probably a more difficult target profile now for Mark Andrews, who goes right after him. You have a situation with Trey McBride where he's probably the most dynamic and exciting tight end in the NFL. But people think Marvin Harrison is awfully good. You have that situation with Sam Laporta where the Lions are absolutely loaded. So it doesn't necessarily move Laporta down for me, but when we're thinking about ultimate ceiling, it's kind of hard to get off of Dalton Kincaid.
I think that I go back and, obviously I could be wrong about this, but based on what we know now, and you're drafting in late June, are you really going to be upset that you took Dalton Kincaid? Again, it's just like poker. You take as much information as you can, get your money in when you have the best of it. Are you really going to be upset with Kincaid as a late second-round pick in the FFPC at the end of the season? Certainly the outcome might change your thoughts on that. I don't think the process does, right? And that's why I like Kincaid there too, as well, to grab him there. Especially if you wait and he slips to the third round, somebody takes Andrews in front of you, and then you get Dalton Kincaid in the early third round as the 5th tight end off the board. That is chef's kiss good. Let's get into Jaylen Warren. I feel like every single podcast I've done, I have asked a question about the Pittsburgh Steelers running back situation. We've heard Najee Harris is in the best shape of his career. We also know that his 5th-year option has been declined. We always lean on the pass-catching chops of running backs. So when it comes down to it, I think a lot of people are saying Warren is the pick over Harris. I know a lot of people think he is the more dynamic running back over Najee Harris. Warren, this is the first time I'm seeing this, Shawn, in doing shows since, I do shows year round, but doing shows about ADP for 2024. This is the first time I've actually seen Warren in front of Harris in the FFPC best ball tournament. He's going slightly above him. They both have 802 ADPs, but this is the first time I've seen Warren in front of Harris. Shawn, where do you stand on Jaylen Warren in 2024?
Everybody thinks Warren is better, right?
It seems that way, yeah.
It's the question of where do you get with the coaches? Because very quietly, Najee Harris actually sort of had the season that his enthusiast wanted last year. When people are like, who's going to be the 2023 Josh Jacobs? A lot of people wanted it to be Harris, and there were good reasons for that, and he kind of did it, but the Steelers were so bad that it wipes a lot of it out. But he also does it in this context where Jaylen Warren may have been, the 3rd or 4th best running back in the NFL after a Christian McCaffrey, after a Breece Hall. And so if you're that good, where do you really go as Najee Harris? Jaylen Warren was number 1 in evasion rate, which includes forced missed tackles as well as broken tackles. He's number 1 in broken tackle rate. He averaged 5.3 yards per carry in a bad offense. So how do you get Jaylen Warren at those prices when, if anything works about that offense, it will be the running game, and those two guys together will have a very meaningful workload, even if they have to share. And then you look at some of the contingent outcomes with injuries, and you're talking about Jaylen Warren. If Najee Harris isn't there, Jaylen Warren is a 1-2 turn guy. He's not only is the offense set up to amplify what he can do, but he's that good.
When you talk about if anything works in that offense, it's going to be the running game. Does that mean you're just out on Pickens and Freiermuth and Roman Wilson and Calvin Austin and Russell Wilson and all those guys?
I think when you get the price on Freiermuth and you think back to where he was in 2022, he's one of these guys who could kind of do that TJ Hawkinson trajectory where there's some early disappointment, but eventually he gets there. And this isn't a trade situation like when Hawkinson goes to the Vikings and just massively explodes, but you get a very different QB situation, a very different coordinator situation. If it's a good QB or coordinator situation, I don't know that you can make that argument, but sometimes just changing some things around helps. Freiermuth at his price is a bet you can make, because if you're wrong, he's probably still going to score around what ADP is implying. Some of those other players have some more issues. One of the things you have in the show notes that, we didn't get to earlier is this Russell Wilson reporting about how he's so much better. To me, that more or less says that they're in trouble, because you've got a guy who can't play in actual games in Russell Wilson, and then you've got a guy in Justin Fields who evidently can't play in practice. And so you're going to have to wait through the portion of the year where Wilson again demonstrates that the things that made him great in Seattle are no longer there. Then you go to a guy who you didn't think was a good practice player and you don't have confidence in. I mean, that part is tough. I mean, hopefully Wilson just defies my expectations and is good. And that team is fun.
Is there something to be said that the Steelers are basically paying Russell Wilson nothing, but yet they traded for Justin Fields in regards to, because I think especially in the SuperFlex best ball tournament, you want to get the Steelers quarterback right. So Wilson v. Fields at this point, for the longest time, I'd have to look it up right now to see how FFPC players are handling it. But for the longest time, Shawn, they were taking Justin Fields over Russell Wilson this year, which kind of caught me off guard. But when you talk about Wilson v. Fields and SuperFlex in the SuperFlex FFPC best ball tournament, do you have an inkling there, or are you just, as you said, kind of just staying away from that situation?
Well, you can toggle really easily between the best ball tournament and the SuperFlex tournament on our ADP tools for you guys there, FFPC. And Wilson, late 9, Fields late 11. That is kind of moving in those opposite directions, because we continue to get this drumbeat of reports that Wilson is good and that Fields is not good. Mm-hmm. The thing that you had mentioned, and it was certainly the case for me as well, how do you win with Russell Wilson when your coordinator doesn't allow the quarterbacks to score and you're not surrounded by weapons? If you couldn't do it with Sean Payton and he has to kind of go away from you, hide you in order to be successful. Yeah. Now, once they completely hid him, some of the actual numbers for Wilson last year are okay, but that was only after they failed to run their real offense. Is that going to be better in a weaker situation with the Steelers? And so even in SuperFlex, there's a lot of incentive to simply try and play the SuperFlex through a different position than QB if you're confronted with that Russell Wilson pick. Whereas if Fields gets in there, even if he plays poorly, he will score for you in a way that works and that is a differentiator. So people are trying to work out this calculation of the points that Fields will score versus the likelihood that he plays. Every day that it becomes less likely that he plays, he's going to get cheaper.
This is the manifestation of Justin Fields being something in 2024, right? And people want to see it. And I understand why they do. And quite frankly, I'm one of them as well. But we also have to look at the reality of the situation as well, as we find out what the beat writers are saying and what the coaches are saying with all the news coming out of Pittsburgh. Let's shift this to rookie running backs. The 1008 is where Blake Corum is going right now in the FFPC best ball tournament, a guy who was drafted this year by the Los Angeles Rams, not the Chargers, as a guy that could be insurance for Kyren Williams. He could be a guy they want to work in tandem with Kyren Williams. He could be both, right? Where do you stand on Blake Corum as far as 2024 goes? And I always couch this by saying, and this is the dynasty player in me saying this, but like I always feel like these rookie running backs, it takes a year, not for them to get up to speed, but for them to be fantasy difference makers, right? Doesn't always happen that way, but a lot of these guys who are not drafted in the first round, it seems like it's been that way. I don't have a ton of Blake Corum this year, but I guess I'd be concerned, Shawn. Do you think that Blake Corum is fool's gold for 2024, but a huge guy that you want to get in 2025? Where do you stand on Blake Corum?
He's so tricky because so many of the key indicators point in different directions. His peripherals cratered in 2023 after he had looked pretty good in 2022. And so you're looking at all of the actual production that he has as they win the national title. And it really looks like so much of that is on the coaching staff, is on the offensive line, is on the team context, all of those types of things. Then you get drafted into a situation that is both one of the best and one of the worst, and that Kyren Williams is probably underrated right now in terms of actually how good he is as an NFL player, as an NFL talent. He was a fantastic college guy who had some stumbles with health and some other things as he makes that transition. But then once we see him play, you can everything that you want as a Rams coach, he's able to deliver to you. And the Rams are willing to use a workhorse. And so the vast majority of these teams in the NFL, when people are talking about, okay, well, they added this good backup, like, I don't care that much, because you knew somebody was going to get those targets or those touches. And if it goes to somebody who's good and will keep the drives alive, will keep you scoring, all of those types of things, that's not necessarily a problem. With the Rams, it can be a little bit problematic because they have pushed their starter into such clear stardom in a variety of cases that I don't know that you get the standalone value with a Corum that you get a lot of other places, even though they have explicitly stated that that's part of the purpose, right? I think you have to look at what they've done as opposed to what they say. However, as soon as you start to get into any kind of health situation with Williams, and if there's a lack of clarity about his health currently, the fact that he did have good peripherals at different points in college, that he tested really well in the agility drills heading into the NFL. And so you're starting to think, I mean, this is something where if you add a little bit more receiving value that maybe you showed in the past, again, you have that hybrid profile, and now you can be a star. If Williams is out, those very same things then apply to Corum, where the workload could be massive in an offense that will cover up some of his weaknesses as a runner. You probably don't have to be a true star if the Rams go out there and give you 20, 25 touches. So I've been back and forth on it. I think that the price has always been enthusiastic. I often find I want other players at that level, and yet it's important to me over the next month to make sure that I get those exposures up, because the upside for him is finishing as, RB6, RB7. You can't be completely out on a player who has that in their range.
I think that's the thing when we come down to it. I bring this guy up on the show every single week. Baker Boy, Joe Del Zanero, longtime FFPC veteran. I always say he's like the Yogi Berra of fantasy football. He says there's no such thing as a bad pick after the 10th round. Well, Blake Corum is going up to 10.08, so I still include that in there. And he's a player that you want to get shares of. He's a player that could vastly outperform that. And honestly, when you're trying to win a $300,000 grand prize, he's the type of player that you should be looking at for sure. Botanical Extractions, Mile High Luke, talking about the Chargers backfield here. Gus Edwards is hurt. We found out from Bridget Condon last week that Jim Harbaugh said that he's on a really good track to be ready for training camp. He was working with the trainers in minicamp. He wasn't present during OTAs. He's coming up on 30 years of age. The Chargers also have J.K. Dobbins, who they got in this offseason. But as Luke is saying, is the answer Kamani Vidal. And Kamani Vidal is a guy that I missed on in pretty much every rookie draft because I always felt he was going higher than I was willing to take him. But from a best ball perspective, Shawn, how do you feel about the Chargers running back situation right now? And I'll give you the ADPs on these guys, and maybe it matters and maybe it doesn't to you when you're talking about Edwards and when you're talking about Dobbins and Vidal. But right now, these guys in the FFPC best ball tournament, Gus Edwards, 11th round, Kamani Vidal, 13th round, J.K. Dobbins is going in the 14th round. And Vidal and Dobbins are kind of back-to-back there. Is there a guy that stands out to you out of those three players in Los Angeles this year?
Yeah, Vidal is interesting because in the write-up that I had immediately after the draft saying this is how you need to approach your rookie drafts, I was thinking I was going to end up with almost 100% exposure. And then he goes so early that, like you said, it was actually hard to get him. You contrast that with a 13th round redraft price, and that doesn't make sense to me. So there's an exploitable element here where if you actually wanted him at those prices in your rookie draft, you should be clicking him every time in round 13, because for that rookie draft price to work, you need him to score in 2024. And it doesn't actually have to be that he scores at a league-winning way, but I mean, he's not a stash type of player, right? The opportunity that you have in this backfield is this year, where you're competing with guys like Gus Edwards, who even healthy should be your fourth string running back, or Dobbins, who, I mean, I love Dobbins, and so I take him sometimes because I always dream of what might have been.
You and me both.
Right, he says he's healthy. The specific injury that Dobbins has had is one where you can be healthy but not explosive. And so if that's the case, how much do you help? Vidal is a guy who had, broke a lot of tackles, forced a lot of missed tackles, and did it on a huge workload. And his size, athleticism profile, the comps that he has, one of them, you pull up the RotoViz prospect Workout Explorer. That was a mouthful. And you see Javonte Williams, for example. Now, I don't think that he necessarily has the ceiling of a guy like Williams, pre-injury, who was a superstar in college. But I think it offsets some of the concerns that people have about where he was drafted and who he played for in college. Those things, to me, knowing some of the other things about his profile, don't come into play as much. And then again, I think that one of the things that's so much fun about playing Dynasty is it gives you insights into where some of the exploitable prices are across formats and across leagues. What the rookie managers are saying, or I should say the Dynasty managers are saying in rookie drafts, the guys who are tuned into the prospects are saying he's better than what best ball drafters are saying. I think that there's a little bit of an exploitable opportunity there.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I mean, especially when you come off rookie fever, right? All the rookie drafts are ended. You're still used to drafting all these rookie players. They just naturally get pumped up in best ball ADP or redraft ADP or managed leagues ADP. And then you see a difference in Vidal, which doesn't make sense based on where everybody is taking in rookie drafts. I do think that there is something there that could help you win a significant prize this year for sure. Last question for this segment. So much more we just don't have the time to get to, but I do want to talk about Bucky Irving with you. Running back 55, 14-10 right now. I would say for the majority of draft or leading up to rookie draft, Shawn, I heard a lot of high stakes players saying, good player, kind of like the skill set, don't know how he fares once he gets to the next level. And now he is in the conversation to be backing up Rachaad White in Tampa, maybe even having the inside track on that job. He is coming in as a late 14th round pick. Shawn Siegele, where do you stand on Bucky Irving?
Well, Irving is a guy who I think you get more encouraged about once you know that Kyren Williams came in with a lot of similar strengths and weaknesses and was successful. Now, the question is a guy who is small like this and who isn't athletic, do they always need that extra year? Trying to figure that type of thing out, I think, is getting too fine with the projection. You're getting to things that you simply can't know. You look at a guy like a Phillip Lindsay, who has those two really early successful seasons. Now, Lindsay is explosive, so that's a difference, but he's a small guy that teams didn't like. You look at Irving, and purely from a reality perspective, I mean, he was the best running back in this class as a college player, right? His evasion rate was higher than the evasion rates for Trey Benson and Blake Corum combined. He's the only guy who in the last 2 years had both 25 broken tackles and 25 forced missed tackles in both campaigns, and he's a good receiving back who does those same things in the receiving game. He's playing behind a back who was fantastic for fantasy football last year, but doesn't have that same track record for making defenders miss, even going back to a college player, despite being big and fast. So he's the opposite from a size speed profile to what we get with Irving. That contrast, I think, will be interesting. But if we want to focus on what a guy actually is on the football field, I think the contrast between Irving and White will stand out to the coaches. They need a little bit better running back performance, especially in the running game. And so, I mean, I think that he's a better chance to be a starter on talent, skill, what have you. That combination without a starting running back injury than almost any of the backups in the NFL.
Wow. Okay. So this is a great landing spot for Irving then.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, White's somebody where I think you want to give him credit for what he did last season. He had the horrible first month. He fought through that. He is a good receiving back. He can create the big play. You know, you have the speed. He's an athletic guy, but there are some limitations to what he is as a running back that continue to show up. It's an opportunity. It doesn't mean that it'll necessarily happen, but I do think it also is something where it causes you some problems or concerns, or at least raises some questions about White. White is probably one of those dead zone back profiles that if you don't get a great value on it, and I think that anybody who's going to come back and say, well, you're getting a great price on it, so you know the fact that he's a dead zone profile isn't a problem, I think that that's a fair note too.
I want to ask you about so many other players here, but we don't have time. And the reason we don't have time is because I think the next portion of the show is going to be really, really compelling here. SuperFlex tournament drafting tips with the FFPC. We're going to talk about why you need to be contrarian in this tournament. Who better to talk about that than the fantasy football contrarian himself? We'll talk about the ways you can zig when everybody else is zagging, or the way you're zagging when everybody else is zigging. Either way, it's going to all happen, and we'll get into some player analysis. He's Shawn Siegele from the Stealing Bananas podcast, of course, RotoViz.com. I am Eric Balkman. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. We'll be right back after this.
With Dynasty is that it's so hard to get a good league going. Like, it's very difficult to get all these friends that are going to be paying attention, or they're going to stick with it, and they're not going to say, "Oh, I don't want to play anymore. My team stinks. Find somebody else next year." Like, and then you're collecting dues, and then you're getting in arguments, and you're arguing with people on Twitter about dues. Like, we've seen too much of that going on. So it's very difficult. And what happens is you find like 5 or 6 good people that want to play, and then you don't have enough people, and you fill the league with a bunch of weirdos. So what I like doing, honestly, at this stage is, if I'm going to play Dynasty, I want to play on a nice, clean, serious, professional site, and I go to FFPC to play, right? FFPC has never had a league fold. Eric Balkman over there told me that. He's like, if somebody has to leave a league, we just fill it. So your option is, you can go and do a startup, and like Jack said in the chat, you start it, and then you go and you figure out who you're going to take from the top down. And if you want to do like a long rebuild, or a long-term team, or if you want to try and win right away and get a bunch of vets, you can do that. Or you can adopt an orphan team, and with that you go out and somebody quit, and that's so much fun, because then you take their team, and you have all these guys that you like, but then you have all of these guys that they had that you don't like, and that's actually way more fun, because then you can trade all those guys, and it's so much fun to trade. Like, when I go to orphan teams, I used to say, "Oh, I'm not going to take this team because all the players, I don't like them. I only want players I do like." But I've realized that it's actually more fun to take the teams that have a couple guys you really like, and a couple guys that everyone else likes that you don't like, and then trade them. Like, go and grab an orphan team like Gabe Davis and trade him to some Gabe Davis guy. So go do that now. Use you can use the QR code here, or a link in the description, or go to myffpc.com. Just make sure you use promo code COOP when you get set up. They'll give you $25 when you deposit 35 or more. And that's another thing. When you make a league with your friends, Coop isn't giving you $25, right? You have to pay the full dues. This time you get a little discount. So yeah, go over there. And also, for you maniacs out there, they do have high stakes leagues. So these leagues, if you want, you can go big time. I know some of the redraft leagues, we announced on this channel a redraft league that 10K buy-in. I'm not sure the Dynasty ones go that high, but they go into the thousands. So if you want to take this real seriously and get crazy with it, do it. That's the place to do it. myffpc.com, promo code COOP, baby. Go get set up.
Don't forget, you FFPCers, if you want to cash in on all this rookie goodness in 2024, sign up for the FFPC Empire Leagues at myffpc.com. What are FFPC Empire Leagues? Well, they are Dynasty Leagues, but they have a large progressive prize pool that grows each and every year, and it's only awarded once there is a back-to-back winner. Once that happens, the back-to-back winner not only gets the first place prize pool that year, but they get the entire Empire prize pool as well. And then the league disbands, everybody gets their deposits back, and you're free to join a new Empire League over at myffpc.com. That is where to go, myffpc.com. I am joined by Shawn Siegele, the fantasy football contrarian from the Stealing Bananas podcast that he does with Ben Gretsch. And of course, what am I forgetting here? RotoViz Overtime with Com Kelly, everything that you're doing at RotoViz, Shawn. What else am I forgetting here?
Yeah, you mentioned Peter Overzet earlier in the show.
Yep.
He and I have the Best Ball Banana Stand pod that you can listen to on his YouTube, or subscribe to us, RotoViz Radio. We have that show for you there as well. And we're about to jump into the FFPC SuperFlex portion of the show. Colum and I have had a couple of recent listener leagues in the FFPC SuperFlex. It's our favorite tournament. We do a lot with our listeners. They love it. Those shows from the draft that we did yesterday will actually be coming out next week when Corum is on vacation. So anybody who gets fired up about any things we talk about and want to see how the RotoViz drafters who have access to the roster construction explorer, how they're doing. One of the things that's so fun when you have a bunch of people drafting with the same basic ideas, some people have to come off of those because there are going to be some other values and opportunities that come up. So those leagues, a ton of fun.
They are a ton of fun. It's a ton of fun talking with you. And I think one of the things, and I'm guilty of this more than anybody else, because I never know how deep we're going to go. With you, I think we can go somewhat deep, and I do have some players I want to talk about and how they figure in to your specific SuperFlex best ball tournament drafts this year, Shawn. But the thing I want to lead off is sort of like a philosophical drafting question. When you talk about trying to win this $100,000 in the FFPC SuperFlex best ball tournament this year, why is being contrarian still important? Why is it still a thing? Why is it still a good way to win when you are doing the opposite over what many of your competitors in the draft are doing?
And so you've got to try and divide things into a couple of categories, or at least be clear that when you're taking a contrarian approach, that it's actually the approach that also works. And so that was something that really came into play with Zero RB, that article, how we worked through all of the evidence for that through the years. We now have this situation in SuperFlex tournaments, and especially in the FFPC version, which I absolutely love because it's a true SuperFlex with the full PPR scoring for running back and wide receiver and the 1.5 for tight ends, combined with the very slight mitigation of QB scoring. Having other players in the SuperFlex doesn't necessarily doom your roster, right? So you want to be aware of that. Dave Caban just released our newly updated range of outcomes tool, which includes multiple formats, one of which is the FFPC SuperFlex. And that's important because you need to have a good calibration for the scoring levels, high, median, low, what have you, all across the board for all of the players at the different positions in this format to understand what the trade-offs are when you go in a different direction. But that's sort of a preface to discussing what's happened the last couple of years, which is that if you pull up our roster construction explorer, or you pull up the best ball win rate explorer, which has a full heat map of every pick, one of the things that you see is that QB heavy has really struggled and has given terrible returns. I don't think that's hugely surprising when you consider that so much of the value that QBs have delivered in the past couple of years have come from just a couple of guys. That part of it, when you're talking about a Josh Allen, you're talking about a Jalen Hurts, and you compare that to where we were with running backs back in the old days in normal formats, where if you get the stars, then you can win. If you chase those points later in the first round and early in the second, it starts to cause you problems. The other element that you have that might be even more exaggerated in a SuperFlex format than it was in these other formats with running back. One of the things we always talked about is how contingent the running back scoring is, and that when you have a starter go down, the backup may not score in the same way, but the workload in many cases is going to be very predictable. And or there might even be some situations where the backup is more talented. There might be a situation where the committee kind of clears up and the backup scores more points. You have those elements to it. When a quarterback goes down, I mean, his backup is going to go in and is going to score the points. And especially in best ball, where you don't have to start the lineup ahead of time, you're going to get those big games. So the last couple of years, and this is something I always want to note, that the roster construction explorer is going to tell you what happened in the past. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's going to happen in the future. And if you look in a crystal ball and say QBs stay a lot healthier in 2024 than they did in 2022 and 2023, and that QB heavy scoring or drafting bounces back and delivers much better results, that's definitely possible. But one of the things that you're drafting into in SuperFlex when you pick those QBs in rounds 2 and 3 is that, I mean, a lot of those players are going to get hurt, and it knocks out a very high priced selection. And anybody who has taken the backup there has that guy available to them in the tournament, has that guy maybe scoring for half of the year, or hits on someone like a Geno Smith, a Baker Mayfield. Corum and I have been very fortunate in this format and have made a couple of finals in a row. A couple of years ago, Geno Smith, we had some Baker Mayfield last year. Sam Howell was somebody we were heavy on. And again, in the finals, that didn't work, right? But
Yeah.
he carried you to that spot, even if you only had a 2 QB build. So if you draft some of those later guys, and I mean, this is kind of the uglier side of it. So when you talk about drafting some of the later guys, Bryce Young, someone we talked about earlier, Daniel Jones, Bo Nix, Drake Maye, or if you go to that level, I mean, O'Connell may win the job outright, but Jacoby Brissett, Howell, Flacco, Browning, you get a QB injury. It's very difficult to compete with the teams that have those guys and have star running backs and wide receivers from that range that the QB heavy drafters selected QBs in.
Do you think, so obviously that's really good for quarterbacks and knowing how you should handle, 2024 based on what happened in 2023. Are there other ways because you've been playing this tournament for quite a while, Shawn, are there other ways that you feel like FFPC drafters should be doing? I don't want to say the opposite. A lot of people, when you hear contrarian, they just think, oh, they're doing the opposite of everybody else. I think it's just the opposite of like what is expected, right? And I think that can apply to quarterbacks. That can apply to a lot of other positions besides quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end. Are there ways to exploit the way that your competitors are drafting their team for you to try to win $100,000?
Definitely. And one of them, and I mean, again, this is coming from somebody who in most formats is going to push running backs. The star running backs in this format, when you're getting them in that bottom third of the first round, can be massive for you. I mean, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, might be the 2 best picks. Certainly if you're drafting outside of the first 2 picks, those might be the 2 best picks in the entire tournament. The other thing that we mentioned again, with the flexibility of the 2-2-2, and in this case, the 2 is a regular flex and a super flex, is that if you end up with too much running back firepower, that guy doesn't get on the bench, right? So you can add both the stars and you can add your, say, 0 RB candidates late. Those guys can all score for you. The flexibility that you have when you have a balanced roster to take advantage of the high scoring weeks and to make that work in the context of the tournament, whether it's giving yourself a different build than most other strong drafters have, or just taking advantage of the randomness and getting lucky when you hit on a structure that works, but then your players are lucky, which obviously is something you're trying to do. That part of it will be successful for you. It's also a format where, because a lot of drafters realize the value of the QB is very obvious, and then how running back is more important in this format than it might be in some others, you do get a lot of these star wide receivers pushed down. So you can end up with a lot of great receivers, even if you don't draft that early. That's something to keep in mind, a little bit different than other formats. It does come back to this element where sometimes when you're taking your Bryce Young, your Daniel Jones, your Bo Nix, you're like, the wide receiver here is still so good. Why didn't I just take a QB early and not have to pick these guys? So you want to be aware of that part of it too. And what you personally like. In the draft that I just referenced, Corum and I had the 101, which you set up a league and you get the 101. We're like, it's FFPC. It wasn't us. We'll
take the fall. We'll take the fall for that. That's not on Shawn Siegele, people. That is on us. 100%.
But we talked a little bit about Christian McCaffrey there. We did go and do the normal thing of taking Hurts, obviously Hurts, Allen, the top guys. You really want to take the star QB and then wait and wait and wait. But when Jayden Daniels comes back there and the other players at the 212 in your own rankings don't really separate, you're like, well, I know what the history says, but I also know that if both of these guys hit, it's going to be very difficult to deal with my team. So you can even take that sort of double contrarian play off of your own thesis in the right situation if your rankings recommend it. I would never tell people to take a structure that works but doesn't fit with their rankings, and they're going to get worse players than they would have gotten if they had just done something that's either more normal or more contrarian. Follow your rankings, make the structure work for the guys that you want to get.
Do you feel like, and we talk about zigging versus zagging and everything, do you feel like in the course of your career, you have built really good teams by exploiting a quarterback deficiency? I don't know if deficiency is the right word, but you're exploiting the way that the quarterbacks fell to you in a draft, or you're exploiting the way the running backs, as you alluded to. Not many people, I should say not many people, but some people don't value them as much as they should in this type of format. Wide receivers, tight ends, the list goes on and on. Do you feel, Shawn, that you can build a dominant team focusing on any one of those positions in the SuperFlex best ball tournament, and that can be as good as any team you draft? Or do you feel like you really have to nail one out of those 4 positions?
Well, I don't want to just sound like an advertisement here, but
you should.
This really is
absolutely should sound like an advertisement.
This really is my favorite format because there are so many ways to play it. And if you understand the edges, you can play them differently in different leagues and take advantage of that draft room. Whereas in so many formats, the draft rooms are going to be similar. People are trying to take these tiny ADP edges and are going to wipe out any sort of creativity that can happen for you. That's less the case here. And so if you know what the 4 or 5 biggest edges are, you don't necessarily get to or have to play them in every draft. You can play them across different drafts. You will sometimes get ADP values on the guys you like, which, one of the things when people talk about, oh, you got to get ADP value, you got to get ADP value. And you're like, well, the guy who comes up as the ADP value in every draft or every round of every draft is somebody that people are selling. Now, that's obviously not the case. It can't work exactly that way, but it's an emotional sense of drafts that a lot of people are going to have because they're like, I want to get my guys. In these SuperFlex formats, your guys will sometimes fall to you. And that portion of it is just fantastic. When you get your target, a guy you have ranked 2 rounds ahead of ADP at a full round ADP discount, you're like, where do I sign up for the next one? But the thing I would mention about that with the QBs, right, is that if you're waiting on QB and waiting on QB2, like you should do, there's going to be enough flexibility in the way drafters play the format once you get into those rounds that you can exploit that second or third, whatever you want to call it, QB tier in different ways. When you're talking about rounds 1, 2, and 3, it's going to be tight enough. There aren't a lot of things that you can do to get different guys at different ADP values in different drafts. But if you have a variety of targets in that, say, 8 through 11 range in SuperFlex, sometimes you're going to be able to get multiple round values on a specific guy in each draft. And so you balance your exposures that way, but you also get something in terms of your constructions that ADP would suggest is very unlikely. Whereas if you try and do that in round 1 and round 2, those guys are going to go where they're going to go. You're not able to do it nearly as much. So teams that are very QB heavy early are going to be more limited in the types of QB values they can get.
I don't think it's a question, but Austin May in the YouTube chat right now, he has a keeper league where he has Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, Chris Olave, and Garrett Wilson. I think he's just bragging. If there's a question there, Austin, let us know. But congratulations on the fantastic team. We're all very happy for you here on the show. And thank you for watching, for sure. I want to get into, and we can go rapid fire on this, Shawn, because there are so many players I want to get into. But I read some of your latest pieces, or your latest piece, I should say, on the FFPC SuperFlex tournament, and some of these may be teed up for you, but if they're not, that's okay. We can explore it a little bit. But I want to ask you, based on if you're taking a quarterback or a running back or a wide receiver or a tight end, like you've made up your mind for structure, the way that your team's going, this is the right position to pick here, and these are the 2 players you narrow it down to. Let's find out which way you would lean in that situation. Let's not assume any stacks here. And let's just talk about what player would be better for your team in the FFPC SuperFlex Best Ball Tournament. You're staring at a quarterback, right? You know that you're going to be taking a quarterback early on in the draft. Let's say this would be I should have it up. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at what point. Let's say you're deciding between Jordan Love and Kyler Murray. Which one is the pick for you this year?
Yeah, so that's going to be middle of 2, and that one is tough. And that's, again, a situation where Colin and I sort of deviated from this wait on QB to take Kyler Murray in one of these drafts. This one is sort of weird. Probably I am like spinning too specific of scenarios or worrying about things that won't come into play. But if you're going to take Kyler Murray at that price in SuperFlex, he has got to destroy the league for you. I think with his hybrid upside and with those weapons he has now, that his ability to beat guys like Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, those picks in the top 5, 6, he has that. Jordan Love I actually prefer in some of the other formats where you're playing it a little bit more to put some of those stacks together to have a little bit more of a floor to your weekly best ball team as you're working through it. Kyler Murray was one of the top 5 crazy prices in current FFPC SuperFlex leagues in the article that just came out.
Austin, by the way, chimed in on that trade. Should I try to move Olave for a better older option since my keepers are already so young? I would say this. I don't know if there's many better older options that are going to be better for Dynasty or in a keeper league in this case than Chris Olave. I would hang on to Olave. I don't think there's any reason to deal him as well, or at this point. Get back to Jayden Daniels versus Brock Purdy in a second here, Shawn. Mile High Luke. On the DST and the possible edge with finding scoring with the new kickoff rules, do you feel there are defenses and special teams units that could break the game this year? Is there an edge to be had? I'll be honest with you, Shawn. I have made up my mind that I'm not going to make any decisions about that specific aspect of fantasy football until I see how some of these teams are treating it in the preseason. Is there an inkling that you see right now? I don't see one.
No, that's not something that, if there is, it's going to be so thin, and I think it's going to be something that's more obvious in retrospect. Certainly, if there are sharp folks out there who think otherwise, I would defer to them on that.
I would as well. That's above our pay grade here in my life, Luke. We're too busy talking about quarterbacks in the FFPC Best Ball Tournament. Brock Purdy and Jayden Daniels are actually going back-to-back in this format right now, 212 versus 302. So we're pretty close to back-to-back as quarterback 11 and quarterback 12. I think a lot of people, Shawn, in this type of league, when they feel like they need to draft for upside and the $300,000 grand prize, they feel like, okay, Daniels is obviously the pick here because he's the mystery box. He's the young guy. He's the unknown upside guy. But Brock Purdy has all those weapons as well. Is this an even split for you? If you can only pick one, which one are you picking here?
No, I think that in this particular format, especially, that Purdy is somebody that you let fall through and go in a different direction. Jayden Daniels, similar to the Kyler Murray argument, is someone who could crush the entire league. I think there are elements of what he does, and this is backed up by the college stats. And projecting quarterbacks is very, very difficult, but there are some predictive elements too, to elements of his profile that look a lot better than Anthony Richardson's. Now, we saw what Richardson was able to do in just a couple of games that he played last year. That makes it very understandable where he's being drafted. But with Daniels, you could get a lot of that plus elite passing. Now, to get both of those things as a rookie, especially when he's not surrounded by weapons that are particularly elite, I think that it's an unlikely scenario to happen. But his median outcome, his floor outcome, still good if he stays healthy. He's one of the probably the bigger injury risks, but a lot of these guys that we're talking about, Lamar Jackson, Richardson, Kyler Murray, those guys have been hurt, right? If Jayden Daniels stays healthy, he's going to score with them. I think his ceiling is higher than theirs, which is a very aggressive thing to say about a rookie. It's one of the reasons why I think it's much more likely to happen in 2025, but his fantasy profile is just absurd.
Yeah, it really is. 100%. One of the things that I was so excited about last year in my dynasty drafts, and I want to talk about Devon Achane in a SuperFlex Best Ball Tournament regard here, was getting that guy. Achane, I never expected. I don't know if anybody expected to see him have the season he did last year, Shawn. And obviously the sky's the limit this year. A lot of people are very excited about drafting him. He is kind of going close to a player who plays the same position as him, but he's kind of on the other end of the age spectrum, right? And Derrick Henry. Like, Henry's on a new team this year. Henry has his best football behind him, but he still could be very, very good in 2024, playing behind a really good offensive line and playing on a really, really good offense. So in the SuperFlex Best Ball Tournament, if you're made up your mind, you're going to go running back at the, whatever it would be, the end, mid-4th round, we'll say. Is it Achane or is it Derrick Henry for you?
Well, I love Henry this season, and having said that, I barely drafted him because he's kind of in that range where it's still tough, right? Yeah. And so, you're working through that element. Again, this is a reason to love the SuperFlex tournament because Achane is probably a little bit undervalued in terms of ranking the running backs, but it gets exaggerated in this format where Jahmyr Gibbs is in the middle of 2. You have Saquon Barkley and Jonathan Taylor, sort of early 3rd. And those guys have some great things going for them, but are probably, especially Barkley, probably a little bit overvalued when you look at the context. Because of this format, Achane gets pushed all the way down into the middle of 4. Mm-hmm. It exaggerates the gap between them. So if you liked him to start with, now he becomes this unreal type of pick. The Dolphins outscored the number 4 team in running back points last year by like 150, right? So the idea that it's all efficiency, now the efficiency levels were extraordinarily high, but everything about what the Dolphins do amplifies the strengths that their running backs also have, which is elite speed. And so when you're talking about a team that's in the top 3 or 4 of both rushing expected points and receiving expected points, and barring some type of disaster, is also going to be at the top of the NFL in fantasy points over expectation, I guess I think people are overthinking it to be worried about Achane. The same thing is true for Raheem Mostert. Those guys, I mean, unless there's something that is out there, I don't understand. The prices don't reflect what they've done or what they're going to do.
Okay. So Dolphins backfield, totally exploitable. All 3 of them are just Mostert and Achane?
All 3 of them. I think you've got to be drafting Jaylen right too.
Okay. All right. Last thing I want to get in here before we take another break. I really want to ask you about Brock Bowers from a best ball standpoint. Right now in the SuperFlex FFPC best ball tournament right now, we have Brock Bowers going off as tight end 11 at the 707. Now, tight end 10 is David Njoku going off at the 704. I think most people are inclined to draft Bowers here, again, because of the stuff I was talking about earlier with the rookies, the mystery box, the door number 2, that kind of aspect of it when they're trying to shoot for the moon. But David Njoku had an unbelievable season last year, and maybe he is the proper play there because he represents just as much upside as Brock Bowers does. The concern I have with Njoku this year, Shawn, is that the majority of his stats that he put up last year that were fantasy worthy for best ball tournaments was when Joe Flacco was quarterback. And now, God willing, the Browns are going to have Deshaun Watson as their starting quarterback for the majority of the season. So for people having to make a decision on tight end at the start or the middle part of the 7th round, and they're facing Njoku or Bowers, which is the correct one to go with?
Well, Bowers is almost certainly the greatest tight end prospect of all time. You look at his numbers across the 3 different seasons, they're extraordinary. He even does things like handle some goal line touches, which, probably that's not going to be the difference maker. But I mean, Kyle Pitts was the tight end 5 a couple of years ago as a rookie with 1 touchdown, one touchdown, right? And I mean, is Kyle Pitts ever going to score any touchdowns? I mean, that's the question there. He's the tight end 6. I mean, you could look at Njoku and Bowers against him and say that is an interesting question. I mean, I'm still drafting Pitts. I like Pitts. I've been wrong about it before. I hate to be out on the year that he blows up. But this entire group from Pitts to Bowers at 11, I think is closer than ADP indicates. And so you look at Bowers, I think that his price is exploitable, but I also want to make the case for Njoku. I mean, what you said is true. And I do think that you want to be aware of the fact that the points came in bundles with Joe Flacco and that he's not going to be there and that is potentially a problem. And yet you think back to what happened last season. And if you told people that David Njoku scored a ton of points and he had to deal with Joe Flacco as his quarterback, people would be like, he scored despite a guy who's out of the league and has looked washed up forever. I mean, that would be good, right? The other guys that he was catching passes from were a couple of non-passing. Again, I like these guys, so it's not to degrade them per se, but the other quarterbacks who played before that are not starting caliber players. And then Deshaun Watson didn't play well. I don't necessarily think that Watson is going to have a massive bounce back campaign. It is a worry, but you would expect Watson to play better than he did last year. You would expect him to play better than the guys who followed on his heels, and that the overall context there is going to be good enough that Njoku at this price, people look back and be like, what were we worried about? I mean, this guy is... And the other thing about him scoring so many points with Joe Flacco is I think you could argue that the coaching staff has figured some things out and knows what to do with him now. And it's, if it's a coaching staff realization as opposed to a Joe Flacco thing, which is probably a little bit of both, but you do get some new coaches as well. But you have the head guy there. If Stefanski is like, I know what we're going to do with David Njoku in 2024 and does that, it's going to be pretty exciting.
Shawn, does team construction matter at that point? In other words, because Bowers is the young and upcoming guy here, and Njoku may or may not have as high a ceiling as him, do you change who you would pick there based on, whatever this is, the first 6 picks you already have on your roster? I mean, I want to couch this by saying, assuming you don't have Deshaun Watson, or like there's no stacking or anything like that with the Raiders or with the Browns or anything. Just kind of in a vacuum here.
Yeah, I don't think that you worry about that part of it too much in this format with these types of teams. I would say that once those two guys are gone in the middle of 7, you're looking at a potential massive drop-off. Now, Dallas Goedert has been good in some stretches. I do think that he is facing some contextual issues, even if he can stay healthy, that probably limit him. There are some interesting names that come after that, but you probably don't want to miss on those guys in there, especially if you don't have a tight end yet.
To your point, as Shawn is saying, if you don't grab one of those guys in the 7th round and you miss on Goddard in the 8th, you're not taking anybody until the 10th round, according to ADP. And that's Hawkinson, which who the hell knows with him, with his recovery from his knee injury. Dalton Schultz, who is on a team that has a cornucopia of really talented pass catchers. And then Pat Freiermuth, who plays on a Steelers team, which we don't really know what to expect from the quarterback play there as well. So that is your PSA on drafting Njoku or Bowers if you don't yet have a tight end in the FFPC SuperFlex Best Ball Tournament. We only have a few minutes left. I want to take our final break. When we come back, for the Dynasty players out there, let's get into perpetual reloading. What is that? We're going to talk about ensuring a permanent championship window in FFPC Dynasty Leagues with a guy who's done it. Some critical acclaim. He's Shawn Siegele from Stealing Bananas, from RotoViz, from the Best Ball what is it? Best Ball Banana Stand?
Best Ball Banana Stand, yeah.
Best Ball Banana
all the B's
Stand.
in there.
Exactly, yeah. And Eric Balkman, another B, coming at you on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network right after this.
Is Dynasty. And the place to play is myffpc.com. Go to myffpc, use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more. Now is the time to get in there and get set up with a startup draft. Now is the time, now that the rookies and everyone are set, because you can go in and you can start the draft and, you draft your Justin Jeffersons and Jamar Chases. And now that we know where the rookies are and where they're landing, you get going on that. So you want to try and set a startup draft for this week coming up if you're not involved yet. So go get involved. Use the QR code here or use the promo code that's in the link in the description here and get yourself going on Dynasty so you can really enjoy these players and draft the players you believe in. If you like Michael Penix Jr., you got to play Dynasty because you got to wait for him, but the payoff is big. And same with like Pearsall and Jackson Smith and Jigba and all these guys. Get in and do that. And I'll tell you what, the orphan leagues over there that we've been talking about, those all got bought up. They're actually all sold. People from this show I know took over a bunch of them. So right now, startups is the way to go. That's the way to rock and roll. It is startup season. Startup season and rookie draft season. That's what's up. Get set up at myffpc.com. Use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more and give you a leg up. No dealing with chasing around your friends and making them pay dues and having your buddy be like, oh, dude, I got to quit the league because I got a dog and I can't pay attention no more and I don't want to do trades. Forget all that. You can play online, MyFFPC, high stakes, low stakes, whatever you want to do with experts. And if somebody leaves the league, it goes in that orphan pool and somebody picks it up. The league has never been disbanded on FFPC.com. That's directly from Eric Balkman over there has told me that. So that's what's up. Get
The FFPC main event is open and open for registration right now. If you want to join it to take your chance at a $1 million grand prize in a $6 million prize pool, go to myffpc.com, myffpc.com. You can register now. You can get your teams locked and loaded as you try to take your shot at a 7-figure grand prize, whether you want to draft live in Las Vegas. I'll be out there. I'll buy you a drink. If I see you, it'll be great at Planet Hollywood, or if you want to draft online from the comfort of your own home, either way works. That's the FFPC main event at myffpc.com. Shawn Siegele from RotoViz, the Best Ball Banana Stand podcast show on YouTube, and of course the Stealing Bananas podcast with Ben Grutch, joining me tonight on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. We got about 16 minutes left, and I it's one of those things where we probably could have done 2 hours alone on Dynasty tonight, Shawn, but we'll get into a little bit here tonight. You wrote a great article for RotoViz, and I want to bring it up. You talk about utilizing something called perpetual reloading to ensure something called a permanent championship window with FFPC Dynasty Leagues. I think everybody knows what those things are. So assuming that, tell us how they do it. How do we make sure that perpetual reloading is what we're doing in our rookie drafts every year to make sure that we're always competing for titles year in and year out?
Yeah, so we always have this tension between playing a little bit for the future and playing for the present. You'll have drafters jump into the startup. They'll draft the veterans. They're trying to win in that first year. Sometimes they do. I don't want to in any way, shape, or form suggest that that doesn't work, because you see some of those teams compete and win titles. And yet, when we're thinking about the best way to control your chances to win, you want to be in the playoffs year after year. You want your championship window to always be open. You don't want to get to a point where you build, and then have a couple of years where you're going for it and then you're rebuilding again. You want to be in it every year. You want to get as many buys as possible so you don't have to compete in that quarterfinal round. You build a more powerful team. You can't control the injury that you have to the key player that cost you a title, or the 50-point game that a non-elite player like an Amari Cooper scores and knocks you out. You can control having one of the best teams every single season. The way that you do that is you build depth in your player talent across all those positions. You build depth in your picks. And in order to execute some of those types of things, you trade down, you trade peak players, you trade young players. You've got to trade things that people want. A lot of times I think when people are trying to, reload or rebuild, they're trying to trade distressed assets at a level that the rest of the group isn't interested in. And then you feel like you can't move. If you're going to make trades, you got to trade things that people want. You can also trade 2 for 1. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's so fun about FFPC is because of the roster limits, you do have some opportunities because people think they're going to have too many players. And so a 2 for 1 also becomes very viable. The format that you guys did such a fantastic job of putting together with Curtis Patrick, the RV Triflex leagues, those are deep, fun leagues where if you have roster depth, you can dominate.
I think that's been great, right? To have something like that. People are always asking, how can I want to play Dynasty, but I want to play chess. I don't want to play checkers, right? And that's what that RotoViz Triflex league allows you to do. It rewards you for not only waiver wire success. It rewards you for starting lineup ability, can do, for lack of a better term. But the depth, right? The depth on those rosters, if you can build that and you can dig deep into that, and any given week, you're going to be ahead of the curve in trying to win those, as I know you have been over the course of the years that you've been playing in the FFPC. Some of the elements when we talk about having this permanent championship window, what are, you don't have to give them all away, but I think that when I was reading this article, there are certain things that I know, like, I was reading it. I'm like, oh, this is why this team that I have has not won, because it didn't have this, right? Oh, this is why this team is always sucking every year and gets into the playoffs and it's eliminated right away. What are some of those elements that FFPC Dynasty players really need to focus on to make sure that they have this particular skill set on their roster?
Well, the main thing is just you need to have all the best players at all of the positions. And people are going to say, well, we didn't need to come to the podcast for that.
Right.
But as you work through it, right, the thing that you do have to build in Dynasty to have this permanent championship window and to get those buys is you need a better team than the best possible redraft team, which means having a little bit of patience, but then also building out at all these positions. I think that people can get a little bit anxious at building QB, but you do need to eventually, within those first several years, get a foundation QB. Mm-hmm. Still tilting running back, even though running backs in Dynasty now are very devalued. That creates an opportunity, again, better than the best possible redraft team if you have running backs that make a difference when most teams don't, because they're not using perpetual reloading, and their ability to create a team that retains value is to sell running backs. With perpetual reloading, you can have all of that in your cake too. You have the running backs. So you have that. Then you have to have just a bunch of receivers. That's where the bulk of your team is. But I really like to come back and have the double elite tight end. There's always work to do. But one of the reasons I'm so excited about this 2024 team is that when I look through my team grid there on the FFPC site, there are a lot of them. I mean, they either have Sam Laporta or Trey McBride, but a lot of them have both. And now after the rookie draft, a lot of them have Brock Bowers. It's difficult to compete with that, even in an arena now or an environment now where, I mean, every year people get excited about the tight ends between, say 10 and 20. very rarely does that pan out. Now, sometimes those guys who were at the top come out of nowhere or come out of a little bit lower spot. I mean, Laporta and McBride blossoming last year was fantastic. I don't know if we have those same guys at those same prices this year. It's a little bit unusual to have that.
I play in a lot of private dynasty leagues with some FFPC players and Dave the Dizzle Gerzak, a co-founder of the FFPC. And this is before the FFPC was even founded. We would play in these leagues, and some of the most successful, this is non-tight end premium. Some of the most successful teams we have seen in those leagues has the generational or the Hall of Fame, whatever you want to call it, tight end. It locked and loaded each and every week. They had a decent guy behind them, like a fringe top 15 guy that could come in and score some points on bye weeks or injuries or what have you. But then they always didn't have this developmental third tight end, right, on their roster that could maybe not make a difference till even year 3. But once year 3 hit, boom, now all of a sudden you have these two elite guys, right? And I think that type of strategy is amplified in FFPC Dynasty, where you have the tight end premium format. Like if you can be elite there, Glenn Lowy, a great NFFC player like yourself, and one of the best FFPC players around. I talked with him several times, and when we talk about Dynasty, he always says elite talent over everything else, and not necessarily, loading up at elite talent with tight ends or quarterbacks, those one-off positions, what have you. But having that elite talent, it gives you the opportunity to do so much with trades, with lineups, with everything, right? And I think that's why you say that, elite talent with above everything else, because I think that's the way to get yourself to fantasy glory, or at least get you on the path to fantasy glory. I want to, so much I want to talk to you about, and I can't get to it. Rookie drafts. Is it more important to have a couple or a few premium picks high in the rookie draft, high in your rookie drafts, Shawn, or is it more important to have a war chest of guys that are going in the late 2nd, 3rd, 4th round? Which is more important, or do you kind of need a blend? How do you feel about that?
One of the things that's so much fun about these formats and about perpetual reloading is you're going to take a hybrid approach. Anytime that you can get a future first round pick, you want to at least consider it, but especially with the shallower total number of roster spots, so shallower leagues from the roster spot perspective, those first round picks are so coveted that you have to pay a lot. So you want to be aware of what you're paying. If you have veteran stars and you have a roster crunch, one of the things that we often do with the perpetual reloading is we get a lot of players and people look at you like, what are you going to do with that? You're just going to cut most of them. That seems ludicrous. Well, you've got to trade some of your stars. You can't trade the 28th guy on your roster, right? You're going to have to cut him. Maybe you trade the 20th and 21st guys on your roster because your roster should be stronger than a lot of the other teams who are not really looking at great guys at 17 through 20. They still want your guy, but you also have to trade the 4th or 5th best guy on your roster. And maybe that's where you get your first round pick, but you keep this whole money machine going. The flip side of it is that because you can be creative in terms of how you make those trades, is that I don't think you want to be scared of getting a lot of picks. One of the drafts I did this year, my partner and I had 13 picks in the first 3 rounds. Not only is that just absurd and a lot, but it also allows you to completely control the 2nd and 3rd rounds. Mm-hmm. So you get the guys you want there at good prices, and then you push some of the value into the future. I was talking with Monty Fawn, who does some things for us and is one of the best FFPC players in history, is good across all formats. One of our teams last year drafted Flowers, Laporta, Rice, and Jayden Reed in the 2nd round. And so I think that we can get caught up in this idea that only first round picks have the ceilings that you need to emphasize them in a format where there are 20 roster spots. That's definitely not the case. And obviously last year we saw a guy going in round 5, 6, 7 who, I don't know, but he had a pretty good season last year.
Let's go rapid fire on these last picks, these last questions, I should say. As far as picks in 2024, maybe it's Ben Sinnott, maybe it's not. Is there a 2024 version of Sam Laporta in rookie drafts this year?
Yeah, Corum and I have been promoting that. The problem, even from the people following that team, they're like, Oh, I mean, there's never a better situation than sitting behind Zach Ertz and learning from, like, the better situation is if he's that good, play him. Like,
Put him
how is
above
Trey
Zach
McBride
Ertz.
on the bench?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So his combination of production and athleticism is fantastic. There are a lot of similarities. Because Sam Laporta is a great athlete and Jatavian Sanders, as we joked about in the first half of the show, is not, there are some differences there, but I'm still going to mention his name as somebody that I think people are going to be surprised by.
The best non-quarterback players in rookie drafts this year in Dynasty, running back, receiver, tight ends. Who are we going to look back on in 3 years and say, wow, that guy really paid off his rookie draft ADP?
Yeah, I did a series called the Rookie 101 series where I made the case for the top 6 guys. I think it was that strong this year. When you get rid of the QBs, you're looking at the superstars. I mean, Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, Brock Bowers, those guys are going to be unreal unless an injury happens. Their profiles are just so good. We see busts. You never know what's going to happen. They're going to be unreal. I think we're talking about long-term and we want some sleepers. I would mention Troy Franklin, Adonai Mitchell, Leggett Sanders. Some of those guys I think will also be, in terms of the long run, some names you're going to want to keep an eye on.
As far as the best steal you had in your FFPC rookie drafts this year, the pick that you were most proud of getting him late, was it Troy Franklin?
Yeah, I think that Franklin is a guy in that range who is a lot of fun. You look at some of the running backs, and we talked about those guys. Will Shipley, I have a lot of. Devontae Walker, Jacob Cowing, 2 of the names I have the absolute most. You know, one of the other things we look at a little bit here, I'm interested to see what Blake Watson does. His combination of running value and then receiving value. And you think about the fit, the Broncos have so many guys, but the Broncos, I think, are, and they're not exactly a sleeper team. People know about Sean Payton and how it's going to work. But if there's a team that just goes out there and flat out beats the Dolphins in terms of running back points this year, don't be surprised if it's the Broncos. Those are some names that I'm really excited to have a lot of in those drafts.
And you mentioned Walker too. Is it the fact that, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'll just put this out point blank. Why do FFPC players not need to sleep on Devontae Walker? Why is he a guy that we need to be caring about?
Well, everybody that I talk to who's kind of, really tied into or dialed into the college stuff and even the draft prospects, I mean, it was evidently just extraordinarily bad at the Senior Bowl to where it cost him so much. But this guy at Kent State was extraordinary. The offensive context there was terrible, and he put up massive numbers. He was up there with Roma Dunze last year in terms of, when he's at North Carolina, he's up there with a Dunze in terms of air yards per game on deep passes. The thing about the Senior Bowl that people don't talk about a lot is that they have tracking on the players, and he crushed everybody in explosive plays. You think about some guys who kind of came out of nowhere who did that in the past. Terry McLaurin, one of those dudes. And then, the Ravens don't seem to be concerned about the warts. They wanted a guy who could be that deep threat for Lamar Jackson. When you're talking about, who's the best sleeper to lead the NFL in 50-plus yard touchdowns, I think it's Tez Walker.
It's compelling because I knew that bump was out there. I knew people really wanted him. I never really saw him leap up to a point where in rookie drafts where I wasn't comfortable drafting. Who were we talking about earlier? That I said, like, he got to a point in not FFPC drafts, but in drafts in general. I'm like, God, I like this guy, but Kamani Vidal, I think it was. I like this guy, but I don't want to take him at this point because there's so many other players I like better. I don't think that happened with Devontae Walker, and I do have a healthy amount of him this year. Trying to look at the Dynasty Rookie Draft ADP is the last question here for you tonight, Shawn. And when I look at Jacob Cowing in FFPC drafts, I see his ADP as I just had it here. Sorry. Wide receiver 62 at the 609. Is he the best FFPC rookie dynasty pick after round 5 for you this year?
Yeah, we took him on every team. I do think Johnny Wilson, who I had mentioned earlier, in terms of a last round guy, is someone you want to have as a dart throw. The one that was surprising to me, and a little bit like Sanders, I did have some trouble getting some co-managers on board with, but once the Eagles went out and said that they thought Will Shipley was good. Then I'm back to looking at his first couple of seasons and his athleticism and his hybrid profile and saying, yeah, his peripherals and his production in his final year weren't very good, but he's a young, explosive athlete. Again, being with the Eagles knocks down one of his great strengths in terms of being a pass catching back. But this guy is much more athletic and dynamic than most of the guys going in that range. I didn't understand his price.
Does Shipley have a future as a 3-down back in the NFL?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that there is as big a gap. And this is going to sound absurd, but there are warts on Saquon Barkley's profile. He's a big back who plays like a small back. He's an explosive player. I think that the Eagles are going to get more overlap in terms of what the two players provide than people realize. And unlike a lot of the guys going in that same range, I mean, Shipley is going to be the same age as the players, the rookie running backs being drafted around him when Barkley's contract is no longer relevant. And so do you stick around if you have a couple of bad seasons? That part becomes more difficult. So the age isn't the only thing that's relevant, but I think it's worth noting that he's just so much younger than these other guys.
Yeah, totally true. A guy who is, I don't know, Shawn, I don't know how much your age is, but you are definitely wise beyond your years in fantasy football analysis. I attribute a lot of my success in fantasy football over the years to paying attention to what you have to say and what you have to write. It's been great stuff. And I think you were ahead of the curve in a lot of things, as I'm sure you're well aware, over the course of the last 10 years for sure. I wish you nothing but the best in all your leagues this year as you try to take down FFPC tournaments, best ball tournaments, whatever you're doing this year. We will continue to check out everything you have to promote or do. RotoViz.com, the Best Ball Banana Stand, Stealing Bananas podcast with you and Ben Gretsch. Is there anything else I'm missing?
Yeah, RotoViz Overtime, the show that I do with Colin Kelly.
Yeah,
we do a ton of FFPC content, a bunch of best ball, a bunch of SuperFlex best ball. Ben and I do a bunch of main events. We've got you covered on the various FFPC formats and have a lot of fun with it every year.
Absolutely. It's great stuff. And I'm so glad I get to pick your brain for 2 hours tonight. I know I'm smarter. I know the viewers are smarter. I know everybody's smarter after talking to you. Thank you so much. Kudos to you, sir, on all your success, and good luck in 2024.
I appreciate it. You too.
That is Shawn Siegele, ladies and gentlemen, from RotoViz, the Best Ball Banana Stand, Stealing Bananas, and of course, RotoViz Overtime, rotoviz.com. Check it out there as well. I want to thank him and our producer, Matt Deutsch. Check out myffpc.com for the main event, the Fantasy Pros Championship, Empire Leagues, Dynasty Leagues, the Fantasy Football Players Championship, Best Ball Tournament, as well as the FFPC Superflex Best Ball Tournament as well. We are back this Thursday. Fantasy Points, Mark Garcia, that's High-Low FF on X, is going to join me for a robust conversation on ADP, how his hardware draft went in the Fantasy Pros Championship, and much more. For Shawn Siegele and Matt Deutsch, I'm Eric Balkman. Thank you so much for spending your Monday evening with us. We'll talk with you again on Thursday.